just because you're listening to and appreciating somebody else's story or viewpoint does not mean you have to change yours. There's something called tensionality where you are holding your own, but allowing space for other thoughts to come in. And so there's that tensionality of holding both of those things. And I think that alleviates some of the fear of, well, what happens if they say something that goes against what I deeply believe in?
Hello and welcome to Stories Lived, Stories Told, a dialogue-driven podcast exploring how to create better social worlds through better communication. I'm Abbie, and today I invite you to join me in conversation with Deb Nathan as we take a communication perspective on creating relational resilience through reflecting dialogue. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we embody curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. So whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being for all of us. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, Deb Nathan. Deb is a licensed art therapist and psychotherapist with extensive experience as an educator, artist, therapist, and supervisor. In 2008, Deb founded Artsbridge, Inc., an organization that utilizes the arts and reflecting dialogue to bring together teens from communities in conflict, while also enabling them to work creatively through their differences. From its inception, Artsbridge has focused on students from Israel and Palestine, which is what we're going to talk about today. You can read more about Deb in the show notes, and you'll hear from her in just a moment. I think there's so much for us to learn from Deb in this conversation, and it's a great episode at a great moment to kind of continue the ongoing conversation that we're having throughout these episodes. They all have been fitting together pretty nicely. What I'd love to ask you to keep in mind as you listen to this episode today is what feels relevant to you. What's something that you could take away from this conversation and apply to your own life, even if the context, this exact stories we're talking about today might not reflect your own experiences? What can you hear in these stories that still applies to your own life? And what can you hear in some of the process, in the tools and skills that Deb and I talk about today in terms of reflecting dialogue and relational resilience? Two really wonderful ideas that I am excited that we all get to learn about today from Deb. So let's jump right in and begin the conversation with Deb. Hi, Deb. Thanks for joining me for this conversation.
Hi, happy to be here.
I'm really happy you're here too. To start us off, I'm continuing on with this pattern that I'm really loving of having us start with a question of how are we arriving? Do you feel like you can name how you're arriving right now, or would you prefer I start us off?
No, I think I can talk about that.
Great, go for it.
I think I'm arriving with thoughts of a world in chaos and paying attention to that, and people not being able to have difficult conversations with each other, and just a polarized world. And also I'm in the middle of recording training modules for facilitators and educators. So that's in the forefront of my mind as well.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great place to start. What I'll share about how I'm arriving is maybe similarly, I'm coming off another podcast recording that I just did with Karina Solso, and that episode will be out by the time this one comes out, so people will have some context for that. That I really love this idea that I learned, first in my communication classes of pluralistic truths and many stories coexisting at once. I think it's kind of a beautiful narrative and helps to make some sense out of the complexity of our social worlds, that, yeah, we all have different stories, and many of us contain many different stories, even about a single event. And I think it's really beautiful, but just the conversation I had with her really has me thinking about the the complexity of the reality of that, of how, okay, yes, there's many different stories. And then how do we coordinate those stories and how do we kind of still come together across our very different stories? So that's front of mind for me today. And, maybe reflect some of what you've shared about what's going on in our larger world. Another personal context I can share is that I've been working on writing a speech, which I have not done in a long time, but used to do a lot of because I competed on the speech team for my high school and college. So it's kind of like flexing a muscle that's a little bit out of practice, but I'm really enjoying it. But by the time this comes out, I will have already given the speech. I get to participate at the Central States Communication Association conference, which I'm just really,
Nice.
really looking forward to because I love communication and talking about it with people. So that's kind of front of mind for me as I've been figuring out what I want to say about research and practice. I think is kind of the intersection that I'm speaking at, and how there's so much great knowledge and theories, and how do we kind of translate that outside of academia so that it's accessible for people. So that's what's front of mind for me going into our conversation. Happy to hear about where you're at, so thanks for sharing that. And let's keep going with you. What else do you want us to know about you, Deb? I'd love for you to introduce yourself in the way that feels best to you. What do you want us to know going into this conversation right now?
Okay. So I've had a circuitous journey to where I am now. And I think that that has actually helped me arrive to where I am now. Um, First of all, I love being a partner and a mom and a grandmother at this point. And I think that that's primary role for me, despite everything else that I do. I do have a PhD in behavioral sciences from the University of Twente in association with the Taos Institute. And I did my research on the work that I've done with Israelis and Palestinians on relational resilience. And complexity is a big part of that as well as multiple stories, multiple narratives. I'm also a psychotherapist with a private practice in Massachusetts, and I'm an artist when I have time to get into my studio. So I'm hoping to be able to spend a little more time there these days. That's kind of my therapy, is getting into the studio. So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah. What do you think you can name? What are some of the experiences that led you to want to do the work you do to study behavioral sciences and be a psychotherapist?
Yeah, I've always been interested in people and stories. And oddly enough, I think when I was younger, I was kind of conflict avoidant.
Mm-hmm.
And as I've lived my life, I begin to realize that conflict is really a good thing. It's what helps us move forward in the world. And so I think that the work that I do kind of stems a little bit from that. My work with Israelis and Palestinians, I grew up with a traditional Jewish narrative, and I lived in Israel for 3 years. And so many things that I experienced conflicted with the narrative that I grew up with,
Mm-hmm.
that I really began to question my narrative, not to throw it away, but to kind of deconstruct it and create a new narrative that includes the lived experiences that I've had. And meeting Palestinians and getting close with Palestinians and Israelis and realizing that there's so much in common. And there's got to be a way to help Israelis and Palestinians learn how to engage more constructively. And if we can start with young people, I think that that's a great place to start. So I've worked with teens mostly.
Yeah, yeah. Tell me more about that work you've been doing.
Yeah. So Artsbridge was founded in 2007. And it started as a summer program for Israeli and Palestinian teens. We brought up to 30 teens to the United States from Israel proper in the West Bank. And they learned how to engage with one another. So we wanted them together 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So it was a 3-week program. They lived together, they ate together. Mornings were spent learning how to have difficult conversations. And I created a model based on reflecting dialogue that helps them through that. And so before they even talked about some of the really difficult issues, they learned how to talk about them. And then in the afternoon, they worked on collaborative art projects together. So they chose what medium they want to work in. We chose their partners for them. So it was always a mixed cultural pairing.
Mm-hmm.
And over the course of 3 weeks, they had to create a piece of art. The only requirement for that was that each of their voices was represented in the piece. And how they did that was up to them. We did have an orientation before the program so that they got to meet in the region before. I also met with their parents before, so the parents were fully aware of what their teens were going to be doing and answer any questions they might have. And then there were 3 follow-up seminars that went on throughout the year that helped them integrate these new ideas into their lived experience. It's not an easy thing to do because they go back to the same conflict. And so that's really where the idea of relational resilience comes in, is how do you maintain these ideas while living in the midst of conflict? And then every other year we would have alumni conferences that invited students from all years to come together and sort of have more in-depth conversations, and we'd have guest speakers and they'd get to know each other. So that was going on until COVID. During COVID, we focused on supporting our alumni. We would have Zoom conferences. And then just as we were going to have our next summer program, October 7th happened. And I feel that there's other work that needs to be done right now, besides supporting our alumni. But in terms of the trauma that all the people there have experienced, I think there's a little bit of healing that needs to take place. But that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. What are some of the pieces of art that you remember that emerged from these summer sessions?
Oh my gosh. Well, what was really interesting is when people hear we're bringing Israelis and Palestinians together, they immediately think, oh, it's a peace program. Well, we're not a peace program. That's not what this is about. A peace program, you imagine you're going to go through this program and magically peace is going to break out, or you're going to go home and everything's going to be different. It's not. You're going back into the same situation. But when the students would first start their art projects, so many of them would do things like creating a sculpture of a peace sign or images of people holding hands around a world and things like that. And as the dialogues became richer and deeper, you'd see their art projects evolve. So we had one team that created what they called adaptation of Guernica, which was based off of Picasso's Guernica, but it juxtaposed parts of an Israeli flag and a Palestinian flag with images of the conflict. And they not only create the piece, but they have to write a narrative as well. And the narrative is, first of all, the name of the piece, why they chose to do that piece, what the meaning is behind it, and what it was like working together. And so they wanted the world to see the difficult lives that they were living.
Yeah.
We had another team that was a young Palestinian gentleman from the West Bank and a Jewish Israeli. And they just kept wanting to do a painting of a peace sign. And I'd go in and ask them to tell me a little bit more about their art and why they were choosing that. And I would walk around, facilitators would walk around to have conversations with them, just to help them thicken their ideas a little bit. And every time I went, I says, well, it's about peace. And I'd say, well, tell me more about that. How do you understand peace? I don't know. It's just peace. And this went on and on
Yeah.
and on. And finally, one day I went in and they're still on the peace thing. I said, yeah, so I'm really curious about this idea of peace and how you understand it. What is it that you imagine about peace? And the Jewish Israeli finally said, I don't know what peace is. I have no idea. Peace died when Rabin died. Yitzhak Rabin was the prime minister that was assassinated. And I said, wow, I said, that's really a difficult thought. And I turned to the Palestinian. I said, did you know that that's what he was thinking about peace? He said, no, I had no idea. I said, is there anything in your life that you can imagine connects with that? He says, well, yeah, I guess when Arafat died, it was kind of like that for me. And so they ended up creating two tombstones, and tombstones in the Middle East are flat, right? They're not the things that we imagine in the States. And they created them out of cardboard boxes, and they had an image of Yitzhak Rabin on one with the colors of Israel. And then the Palestinian had, and it wasn't just the colors of Israel, it was kind of like the colors of Israel plus the colors of sort of the settler movement. So it incorporated all aspects of Israeli life. And then similarly with the Palestinian, the different colors of Hamas and Fatah. And so they brought the politics into it. And the two were, so one faced one direction, the other faced the other direction, and they were at the very corners, sort of the left upper corner of one and the right upper corner of the other were almost touching, but they were about a quarter of an inch apart. And that was the piece that they ended up creating. So there are so many stories of, the experiences that the students had and how they understood those experiences and how they portrayed them in the art.
Yeah.
But those are like two very brief examples.
I'm curious to know more about the experience you had on the front end and maybe the transformation that you saw happen throughout these programs of that kind of inclination, or what in CMM-ish language we'd call like the moral force or the logical force of the kind of like assumed or taken for granted expectations of what the story is or how we might act into the story, that you were able to name already this pattern that so many of the students would come in and default to we'll make something about peace. This is about peace. But you articulated it's not a peace program. So I'm curious what your experience has been of where you met these teens when they came to your program, and maybe if there's something that you could articulate about why that logical force or moral force for an emphasis on peace was so strong and what you tried to offer instead.
Yeah, it's a good question. The teens came for a lot of different reasons. Some came because it was a trip to the United States. Some came because they wanted the other side to know how much they were suffering. Some came because they never met somebody from the other side and they were curious. So they all came for different reasons. There are a lot of programs that work with Israelis and Palestinians and bring them together, and kind of based on social contact theory that, bring them together, let them become friends, and everything's going to be okay. And it doesn't work like that.
Right.
And so we really emphasize this is not about making friends. This is about learning how to engage with people that you don't agree with.
Yeah.
And that, you have deep issues with. And so that was a little confusing for them in the beginning. They come with their narratives. And to the extent that some students brought cue cards with their talking points on them.
Wow.
I was a debater in high school and college.
Yeah,
so
sure. Yeah.
I recognized the patterns. And I also remember having to unlearn everything I learned in debating to get to where I am right now.
Right.
Those are all the kinds of things that I wanted to help them with. So, learning that you can engage with people that you deeply disagree with, learning that you can find a path forward that's not about mediation, it's not about compromise, it's about finding a new path forward that moves you forward together. And that was a really difficult idea for most of the students because they had never encountered anything like it. And they were very much used to arguing and trying to prove the other wrong and that they were right. I mean, we had one year where the students just kept going, well, why did your government do this? And why did your government do that? And we can't speak for our governments. We can't speak for a whole people. And so, as we evolved, we realized it was really important to stick to personal narratives. How does the conflict affect you personally? Because that stories really touch people. That's what people listen to. They don't listen to what a government does or what's right or what's wrong or who's guilty or who's innocent. That tends to shut people down. And so listening to personal stories really allowed others to hear them and connect in a way that they might not be able to otherwise. So there was a real shift there.
Yeah.
And there were a couple phrases that I would hear that helped me know that there was a shift happening. One was them saying, wow, this is really complicated. Another was, wow, we're just kids. We shouldn't have to talk about these things. And the other one is, I don't agree with what they're saying, but I can understand where they're coming from. Those were the kinds of phrases that I was looking for that helped me know that there was a shift happening. And then, the goal is to help them carry that through into their lives. That's the most important goal. Giving them a great experience is one thing, but letting them and having them take that away with them and maintain it is the challenge.
Yeah. How did you go about doing that? What does that process look like in those follow-up sessions you mentioned?
So the first session, which would take place around October, was, okay, what was it like being back? What did you notice? So, they would say, wow, I feel like I got home and a bubble burst. And I noticed that everywhere around me, people were just arguing. Like nobody was talking to each other. They were just arguing with each other. So those are the kinds of things that they noticed. And they noticed how difficult it was to have any kind of conversation with people because they just wanted to argue. And so that's the first step, is recognizing what's shifted, what's changed. The second is, all right, what can you do about that? How do you maintain your stance of curiosity and your openness when the people around you aren't interested in that? And so the second session in the winter was, all right, how do you maintain these ideas? So we would bring guest speakers in from other organizations that they could get involved with. We had them do projects. So some of them would give presentations to the schools. Some of them would work in their communities, volunteer with different organizations that worked with little kids. So all different kinds of things. A lot of students said they tried to facilitate conversations in their classrooms when things would get out of hand with a conversation. So that was the second. And then the third session was, how do you want to move forward? What is one realistic thing that you can do to create change. And to me, that's really important because, especially teenagers, they have very grandiose ideas. Either they think nothing can change and it's hopeless,
Mhm.
which most of the teens that we've worked with have had, or I'm going to change the world. I'm going to end the occupation. I'm going to create peace. Well, that's not realistic. And so, what is it that you can do that you have control over that might make a difference in your community? And so, helping them take what they've learned, take these new ideas, and then put them into practice.
Mhm.
And then maintaining the conversation.
Yeah, what kind of things have you heard people say about their one realistic thing?
A lot of them would work with other kids, or they joined other organizations where Israelis and Palestinians were working together. One, in my research, when I was having conversations with alumni, one young woman became a nurse and she said, I go into a patient's room and I find out so much more about the patient than my colleagues because I'm curious. I have a
Mm.
conversation with them. I ask them questions and I find out much more about what's happening with them than the others who are just looking at the chart and seeing the ailment or the chart as opposed to the person. So they were using it in that way. Some became educators, some worked within their communities to help create conversation. So they're doing lots of different things. They're not all artists. Art was
Mhm.
just the medium, but they're using it in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, I think I'm so curious about this kind of process that you've named because I think it's not just in this, specific context that you're speaking into of Israel and Palestine conflict. There's these are great tools that so many of us could
Yeah.
use, and I do have a sense of going against the current or swimming upstream, that it feels like an uphill battle sometimes to try to engage people in dialogue, actual dialogue, like you do in your program. And that's a big part of what I, hope to offer people, is like better communication tools to be able to be more relational and lean into the complexity. And yeah, it just feels like an uphill battle sometimes when the larger culture or those, norms that we've fallen into are so, we live in such a polarized world, and the ways of being we have, recreate that and uphold that. And so it just is, I think, a huge area of need and a huge kind of question mark for me that I'm very curious about.
Look, it is, and one thing that I share with the students is, yeah, it's hard for me too.
Hmm.
And sometimes I get frustrated, and sometimes I just want to say, why aren't you listening? But having the skills that I have allows me to stay more grounded.
Hmm.
And it's work. Sometimes it's hard work to stay curious when you hear something that you so deeply disagree with.
Hmm.
But what I see happening in the States right now, not only are people not listening to each other, but they're denigrating the
Yeah.
other. And people have their beliefs for lots of different reasons. And, like my students would say, I don't agree with them, but I can understand where they're coming from. That opens a door.
Hmm.
And when you can be curious about how somebody came to the ideas that they have, then you've got something to work with.
Hmm.
And if
Hmm.
you go into a conversation not trying to change somebody's mind, but to learn more about them, to be curious,
Hmm.
they're much more likely to be curious about you as well. And
Hmm.
that's where the magic happens. That's where the
Yeah.
shifts can happen. And right now, I don't see that happening very much. And that's
Hmm.
really sad for this country.
Yeah. Well, you've, named a number of those things that you look for to hear, and okay, that's how I know there's a change happening, but that's not the change is my understanding of it. It's not these kind of surface level, we'll just say this. It's you're using those as an indicator of a deeper change in kind of their orientation or way of being to these conversations and to
Right.
relationships. And so that's what's so curious to me is how does that change happen, because it really does require some real reflection going on. And you mentioned a tool that you use, reflecting dialogue. Is that what you said? I'd love to
Yeah.
know more about what exactly that process is.
Sure. I can tell you more about that. Look, it's challenging. It goes against what most people are used to. In my mind, I see reflecting dialogue as breaking down elements of a constructive conversation.
Hmm.
So, we sit in a circle. There are usually two co-facilitators, and then there's a speaker, an interviewer, and a reflecting team.
Okay.
And in the beginning, the interviewers are the facilitators until
Hmm.
students have an understanding. And the interviewer's role is to ask questions out of curiosity about a person's lived experience. The speaker, their role is to share their story in a way that allows others to hear them,
Mm.
right? So, how do you say what you want to say in a way that allows people to actually hear you? That's easier said than done.
Yeah, very much. Do you have an example of like what that might look like as opposed to speaking your story in a way that might get in the way of others hearing you?
Yeah, I think sharing about a personal experience, this is what I experienced. So, one young Palestinian talked, he was a Palestinian living in Israel who was an incredible soccer player. And he was often caught getting into fights at school. And parents were at their wits' end. They really didn't know what to do. And we interviewed him, and he talked about they pulled him out of his school and put him in a school that was a Jewish Israeli school. I mean, schools are pretty segregated
Okay.
in Israel.
Hmm.
And there was a coach. He had a great coach in the beginning, and he was playing soccer, and then he was always on the field. And then that coach left,
Mm.
and another coach came in and benched him so he couldn't play soccer. And
Wow.
then he started getting ridiculed by the teammates
Hmm.
and slurs about being Arab and an enemy and all kinds of things. And it was really painful for him. And so here's this really tough kid
Mm.
sitting there talking about some of the things that they would say to him and how the one thing he loved the most he wasn't able to do. And, he started tearing up, which, imagine this tough kid sitting there. And it so moved everybody. And it was a chance for people to see what life is like for so many Palestinians living in Israel,
Mm.
and Jewish Israelis. We had one young Jewish Israeli who shared the story of two friends he lost in a bus bombing. And he was supposed to be on that bus that day and
Mm.
was late for school. And so didn't get on the
Wow.
bus. So these personal stories were allowing them to really hear the impact of the conflict,
Hmm.
not what causes the conflict, not what the governments are doing, but what are the effects of the conflict on the people that you're sitting in the room with. And so the interviewer asked questions that help bring that story out,
Hmm.
help the speaker feel comfortable, and to also give the speaker the opportunity to hear what they're saying. So that's where the reflecting team comes in. So the speaker and the interviewer are talking to each other. The reflecting team sits on the opposite side.
Mm-hmm.
And there are 3 or 4. And usually, again, in the beginning, the other co-facilitator will sit with them. Their job is to simply reflect on what they heard. So what does that mean? It means, how did what you heard resonate with you? What had meaning for you? What was happening inside you as you were hearing this story? So, wow, when I heard Ahmad talk about his experience, it was really painful. I can't imagine what it would be like to not be able to do the thing that you really love to do. Or, I had an experience like that once. I could really empathize with what the speaker was saying. And so they don't look at the speaker or the interviewer, they just talk to each other. So there's no pressure on the speaker to respond or to behave a certain way.
But the speaker and the interviewer are listening in, but they're not
They're
a part of the
listening.
conversation.
Right.
Interesting.
It's like there's a two-way mirror.
Yes,
there,
right.
Right. And they just talk to each other.
Mm.
And then it goes back to the speaker and the interviewer, and the speaker can respond to whatever they want to respond to or not. And so if you think about it, speaking in a way that others can hear you, being curious, asking questions out of curiosity, and really listening are 3 elements of a constructive conversation. Those are the things that help you have a constructive conversation. So they don't realize they're learning reflecting dialogue, but they're learning how to have difficult conversations. And you mentioned a way of being in the world. And it's funny you should say that, because one of the things I tell the students is, this is not a technique.
Yeah.
This is a way of being in the world that you can take with you and be that lived experience and that way of being in the world. And that's, I think, a really important thing. It's not like something, oh, this is a time, okay, reflecting dialogue here, but then I can talk any way I want when we're not doing that. And the students would get used to, if we weren't in a reflecting dialogue and something heated started coming up, students would start saying, I think we need to have a dialogue about that.
Oh, that makes you feel great as a facilitator, I bet.
Right. Yes. I mean, just so many stories and shifts that you see happening that are touching. They affect me. I mean, I grow and learn from the students at least as much as hopefully they get from the program.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. That makes so much sense to me because, there's within the world of communication studies, there's so many great tools and skills. But what feels really important to me is kind of going beyond that and offering, the language I use being a communication perspective, which my hope is that that's something much more embodied. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about that part of the shift into what you're asking of these students. And, that thing that we could all use is that I think so often we are unable to hear other stories because we are coming from a place of fear, I think is probably what I would name that. Probably there's a number of other things as well. Yeah. But it feels, so if you're telling a different story than my story, it feels like a threat. And so that feels like that's a part of that barrier that the work that you do is about overcoming to move from interacting from this place of fear and maybe scarcity to a place of like abundance. And like I said earlier, the idea that I think is really beautiful, that there are many, many stories and they coexist, but also very complex in the reality of that at the same time.
And understanding that you can, just because you're listening to and appreciating somebody else's story or viewpoint does not mean you have to change yours.
Yeah.
So there's something called tensionality, where you are holding your own, but allowing space for other thoughts to come in.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's that tensionality of holding both of those things. And I think that alleviates some of the fear
Yeah.
of, well, what happens if they say something that goes against what I deeply believe in?
Yeah. Yeah. I think maybe in the kind of same way you've articulated that, in this context of conflict, there's an instinct to jump to, well, peace. Well, we have to resolve the conflict and we have to
Right.
jump to peace in our kind of personal relationships in our own social
Yep.
worlds. There's that same kind of instinct that, oh, any moments of tension, got to resolve it, rather than being curious about the space you're in, the conflict or the tension at whatever level, and learning to navigate it so that, I ultimately with conflict, you would like that to be resolved so that people are not living in horrible conditions. But if you're jumping from conflict to peace without a kind of thoughtfulness, probably about how you're navigating it, I would imagine, creating a pattern. And I'm really grateful to, hear from you and hear about your program today, because I think for so many people in the United States, conflict between Israel and Palestine was not on their radar until October 7th. So it's really been like just a couple of years that this is more front of mind, and people don't understand the much longer and more complicated history of that conflict.
Well, and what we saw happen after October 7th was that there was an immediate polarization. It's kind of like, I'm not a scientist, mitosis, where they separate and go to their sides, right? They split and go to their sides. And there was no empathy for the other.
Yeah.
Right. So you had 2,000 Jewish Israelis, innocent Jewish Israelis, who were slaughtered, and how many taken hostage. And the stories of the young women that came back, and there was no empathy for them if they were, pro-Palestinian, and I'm using quotation marks, right? And on the same token, you had others who would only see the pain of the Jewish Israelis and not what's happening to innocent families in Gaza. Both can be true. And people are suffering. Innocent people are suffering on both sides. And if people can't see that, that's a real problem. And, you can liken that to what's happening in the States on a different level. One of the reasons I don't use the term conflict resolution is because I don't see it as a resolution, which feels like an end to me. So I call it conflict navigation.
Yeah, great.
Right? Because we need conflict. Conflict's not the problem. How we navigate conflict, how we deal with conflict can become a problem, right? And so it's finding a way forward. Yeah. And that's motion. That's a constant. And so I think if you can think of it that way, as opposed to, oh, okay, here's the resolution to the problem, then there are many more possibilities than just thinking of solving the problem.
This is just wanting to be specific about this language right now, because you were offering some great distinctions. I think is that, especially in this context, people can conflate conflict with war, and I think war is like one manifestation of a conflict. And so I think that's maybe something I'm hearing in what you're saying is you're not saying, let the war rage on. You're saying there's a real conflict that means a lot to everyone involved at the heart of this. The manifestation of that conflict in war is horrible for what it's doing to people. Yeah, just I feel like that's an important distinction to make. And it's leading me back to language that I know you use that I want to get specific about, understand your definition of, because I think it's really meaningful language of. You've talked about your program with Artsbridge and other work you do as being a part of building relational resilience.
Yes.
So I'd really love to know, what does that mean and what does it look like? Good
question. So when we think of resilience, the sort of traditional model of resilience is self-empowerment.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, it is.
I can overcome adversity. I can deal with this. That's fine. And there's a place for that. But when you're talking about conflict,
Yeah.
relational resilience, we need to learn how to relate to people. People we like, people we don't like, people we agree with, people we don't. And what happens is if you think about individual resilience, you don't think about the other. And so relational resilience is being able to see multiple perspectives, right? Having confidence in your relationships. So when you're having a conversation with somebody that you don't agree with, being able to hold your own and also listen to the other. And that does take relational confidence. Appreciating complexity, because it is complex. There isn't just one way of looking at something. I think the other thing is, rather than thinking of self-empowerment, think of mutual empowerment. If we work together, we both become empowered, or we all become empowered. And so engaging more constructively with others and being empowered together by that. Tensionality, I already talked about, being able to hold your own while allowing space for other viewpoints to come in. And I think one of the things that's most important, well, equally important, but being able to entertain uncertainty.
Yeah.
We don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
We don't know what the truth is. You know, when we go to school, how many of us have had to take true or false tests? I used to hate that because it's like, well, I don't know. If you look at it this way, you
Yeah,
can, right. But that's what we're taught. We're taught that there is a truth out there to be found. All we need to do is look for it, and there it is. There isn't one truth to be found. We create truth.
I think we do ourselves such a disservice by trying to oversimplify a very complex world into something that true, false, right, wrong, good, bad.
Right.
Yeah.
But in order to get there, you have to be able to entertain uncertainty.
Yes.
You have to be able to say, I don't know what the answer is, but how are we going to manage this? How are we going to walk through this together? Because I don't know what the answer is. And that's really hard for people. That's unsettling for people because we want answers. Answers feel safe. And I think that's one of the things that leads to this polarization. You know, we tend to go to our camps because there's comfort in that.
Yeah.
There's comfort that everybody around me feels the same way I do and agrees with me. And, you know, there's a level of comfort in that. And so when you entertain uncertainty, when you think of this way of looking at relationships, it's unsettling, and you have to be comfortable with that. Not an easy task.
Yeah. And I think it's good to say too that it's not a bad thing to find people who agree with you, but if you are only surrounded,
right?
This is bringing to mind a experience I had years ago that a friend of mine kind of, boldly said, well, I cut out, I just don't talk to people. I just don't interact with people who disagree with me. And I was younger than this person. I remember being like, oh, okay. But kind of trying to, I really respected this person, and they were a communication studies person too. And it's just kind of like trying to make that make sense in my head of like, oh, okay, boundaries, I don't know, whatever. But the more I thought about it, I was just like, that is so undialogic and unrelational and does not feel constructive at all. But it probably feels very comfortable to just wholly discount a person rather than lean into the tensionality, like you said.
Yeah. And look, when you're dealing with trauma, the irony is that all the things you need in order to be able to navigate conflict constructively are things that are taken away in the midst of trauma.
Say more about that.
Well, if you think about it, people who struggle with PTSD or who have been traumatized, and especially like what's happened since October 7th, you don't trust people.
Yeah.
So you're not open. You see things in black and white. You tend not to take risks.
Mm.
Uncertainty is really, really frightening.
Yeah.
Right. And we have a hard time imagining anything other than our lived experience. And that's the other element. By the way,
Mm.
I two other elements of relational resilience that I want to just mention briefly. One is creativity and imagination,
Mm.
because you have to imagine
Yeah, right.
a future different from what has existed, right? And you have to think creatively in order to get there. And the other is this idea of reasonable hope.
Mm.
And that's different than how we tend to see hope or a pie in the sky hope, right? It's reasonable hope means, look, this is really hard. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if we're going to be able to solve this, but I know if I don't try,
Mm.
then nothing's going to happen. And so I believe if we work really, really hard, then we can have a more constructive outcome.
Mm-hmm.
So that's reasonable hope. And so when you're dealing with people who have never experienced life without violent conflict,
Mm-hmm.
how can you expect them to imagine something different if
Yeah.
they've never experienced it?
Yeah.
So sorry, I digressed, but
No, that's great. That makes so much
elements.
sense. And that's a really wonderful, real example of something I've been thinking about and started talking about recently, that like, maybe I have a kind of analytical brain coming into this, but I'm very curious, like, what's the function of stories? And I think a large part of it is expanding our imagination of what's possible. That if, you grow up with one story about how your life looks, then you're not, how could you possibly imagine anything different? But if you get to receive many stories about what is possible for you, what you could choose, what kind of life you could have, or what kind of life your family could have, or your community or your country, then your imagination is like, it's like fuel for imagination and creativity.
Right, right. I mean, it's often really difficult for people to move beyond the hurt.
Yeah.
And so when people come into a conflict situation, I don't care if it's Israelis and Palestinians. I don't care if it's people in the workplace or, people in the political sphere. If you come in with this particular narrative of what the conflict is, so I'm right, they're wrong, they did something really terrible to me, and I can't deal with that. Okay, I don't know if that's true or not, but is that working for you? Is that story allowing you to move beyond this particular conflict?
Mm-hmm.
What is the story that we can create that will allow us to move forward?
Yeah.
That doesn't negate the pain or the challenge, but it goes beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Does that make sense what I'm
Yeah,
saying?
it does, because the lens that I'm coming at this with is like, communication is generative. Our communication creates our social worlds.
Right.
CMM says the goal is better social worlds, but regardless of that, it's always creating social worlds. And so the ways that we are showing up to each other with this fear, with this, need to stay comfortable, to keep things simple, to not lean into that uncertainty, that creates the kind of social world that we're in now. And so it's, I think, really meaningful to look at, well, what do we want to create instead? What are we making, and what do we want to make instead? And that's what I really love about CMM, is this language that it really, I think, kind of empowers not just the individual, but the individual in relationships to say you've got choices about how you're showing up and what you're creating. And at the same time, we call it mystery, that uncertainty that you've named, that it's so important to say, hold both of these things to be true at the same time.
Look, there's a lot of synergy between
Yeah.
CMM and
Oh, yeah.
that I'm doing. And
Yes.
so I really identify with the ideas of CMM.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I referenced them. I'm pretty sure I referenced them in my dissertation as well, because it is that sort of the multiplicity of narratives. And how do we coordinate meaning making? I think those are really important aspects that we don't learn. We almost learn the opposite when we learn that there's a right and a wrong and a black and a white.
Yeah.
And we've got to go beyond that. And we have to learn, unfortunately, your friend who is not talking to anybody she disagrees with is missing out on opportunities for expanding her worldview, but also to create better understanding. You can listen to somebody and not agree with them. You can also, sometimes you have to figure out, is it worth, is this person somebody that I'm going to be able to engage with? Or are they so closed off that a casual conversation is not going to be useful, right? Because it'll probably turn into a shouting match, or they won't be able to hear. And so sometimes you have to kind of decide, is this a conversation worth having? You can still listen, right? Or you can choose not to engage, but you miss opportunities. So complicated.
Well, yes, so complicated, so well said. And I'm just reflecting on how powerful it's felt to me to hear the stories you've shared, which is in and of itself a testament to the work that you do, that, as we're referencing the power of stories, you're sharing these stories. And so I kind of want to end on that note as well, and just give you one last opportunity to say, are there any other stories that you want to leave us with that reflect any of what we've talked about today?
I guess I can choose one more story. A couple are coming to my mind, but I think the story I might want to end with is, we had one year where it was a really bright, independent group of students. And they came at the orientation. They decided they knew how to talk. They didn't need this crazy way of having a conversation. And so, I asked them to be open and just see what it's like. And when the program started, again, it was like a small cluster of them that said, no, we don't need this. We already know how to talk. And so at that point, it was like, well, let's give it a try. Let's give it a try your way and see what happens. And so they started having a conversation, and one young Jewish Israeli started talking about how much she loved her father and was so proud of him because he was a colonel in the army and he has helped his country so much, and how really proud she was of him. And a couple of the Palestinians in the room, you could just see them starting to seethe. And one young man said, yeah, but do you know what the army does? Do you know what the facts are? And started getting really annoyed with her and wanting to tell her what the facts are of what the Israeli army does. And she was so taken aback and upset, she started crying. And so I stopped it. And I said, okay, this is causing a lot of hurt. Let's see if we can do this another way. And so we did a reflecting dialogue, and I was very worried about the Jewish Israeli who was wounded. And I decided to interview her. And two of the people that were most challenging her, I put on the reflecting team with two others in the co-facilitator. And as I started asking her to share her story, one of the things I asked her was, what was important to you about what your father does? Why is that so important? Why does that make you so proud? And she said, well, my parents came over from Europe, and my parents are really sad because their parents died in the Holocaust and they can't visit their graves. There are no graves to visit, and it's really painful. And, the fact that we have Israel is sort of, it's our safety, it's our home. And that's really important. And we talked some more, and then it turned over to the reflecting team. And this one young woman, one of the Palestinians who was so adamant, said, I'm I can really relate to what she's saying, because my parents can't go back to the home that they lived in, that their father built, because it was destroyed in 47. And so they don't have a place to go back to. And she said it tearfully. It was a very genuine response. And the thing that was fascinating was neither of them ever imagined that they would have anything in common or that they could relate to. And for the young gentleman who wanted to show the facts, helping him over the 3 weeks to understand facts are not always facts and they're not always useful. So what is it that can be useful when we have a conversation? So I think that's a story that kind of illustrates how a shift can happen and how we can better understand each other, even if we don't agree with them.
Yeah, so complex.
Yes.
Yeah, wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's, a beautiful story to end on. And the last thing I would like to offer people as we wrap up is this language that I've already mentioned, a better social worlds. I think that, what we do in this conversation is, because we both, are bringing the energy and excitement that we are to this, is kind of alludes to how this work is a part of creating those better social worlds, which is important for us to define and orient ourselves towards as a kind of collective responsibility that we have to each other in our relationships and our social world. So I won't have us get into that because, like I said, I think we've kind of laid the groundwork for that. But that's kind of the question I want to leave people with, to do reflecting of their own, of how they see this work. Because you work with a very specific group, but like we've talked about, there's implications for all of us, really, truly all of us. I don't feel, too bad about making that generalization. So Deb, thanks so much for your time and your stories and your perspective today. I really enjoyed talking to you.
And I've enjoyed sharing and talking to you. And thank you for allowing me to have this conversation.
Okay, that is all for today's episode. But remember, the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. There are so many ways to stay in dialogue. First, you're always welcome to reach out to me to share your reflections, questions, and ideas. There are also a number of online spaces where you can comment, including the Stories Lived, Stories Told Instagram and the CMM Institute Substack. Links to all these places to connect are in the show notes. If you want to stay up to date, a couple things you can do are follow the show wherever you listen, leave a rating and review, share this episode with someone you want to invite into the conversation, and subscribe to the CMM Institute Substack to get every episode right in your inbox. Stories Lived, Stories Told is an initiative of the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. You can learn more about the CMM Institute and our other initiatives, including our other podcast, Cosmo Parenting, and all our free Cosmo activities, as well as Cosmopolis 2045. There's also the CMM Institute Fellowship and the CMM Institute Press. We have so many great resources that we are so excited to share. Again, links to all of that can be found in the show notes. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.